Maybe I can explain this the best with food. Here I am making sandwiches for my kids' lunches tomorrow. In a similar fashion that you will be making a sandwich when you make your ring. You will have 2 pieces of metal and you will put solder on them and join them together like this. So you'll have your top layer and you'll cut out your design. The shape of your ring will be the top layer. It will be sized exactly the size that it needs to be. And then you'll have your bottom layer. You'll put them together, put solder all the way around, and then it'll fuse them together and you'll have majority of your ring. But before you cut out that top piece of metal, you've got to flow solder on it. But here's the part that confuses everyone. You flow solder on the back side of the top piece, kind of like with the sandwich. The mustard makes everything in the sandwich stick together, but where do I put the mustard? I put it on the underside of the top piece. I don't put it on top. So you're gonna flow solder on the underside of your top piece. And then when you put the pieces together, you'll put solder all the way around the edges, and that will join up with the rest of the solder and hold it together. Obviously, you're probably not going to just make a plain Jane rectangular ring. If you were going to do that, you would use wire like we did at the beginning of the semester. And that's not what we're going to do. So, you are going to cut out the top piece after you flow the solder on it. For example, if I cut out my top piece for my daughter, who's a little extra and likes heart-shaped sandwiches, if I cut out my shape first and then put the solder on, it might work out fine, but you've got more to contend with here. You see, it might get a little messy, might get a little sloppy. See that? But if I flow my solder first, on the whole piece, and then cut out my shape, well, that's just perfect, isn't it? Now, one thing that you need to think about though, and you'll probably notice in my video, is that I want to think about where my design is going to be, because I don't want to waste solder. Solder is expensive, so I don't want to waste it. So when I put solder on when I flow the solder on the back of my top piece, I want to think about where my design's going to be and try to limit my solder to that area. So for this one, with this heart-shaped cookie cutter, the design's going to be in the middle. So I'm not going to worry about putting solder all the way to the edges because I'm not going to use them. That would be a lot of wasted solder. So I'm only going to put solder where I need it. Flow the solder first, then cut out the shape, and look at the difference here. Look how much cleaner cut that one is than this one. So flow the solder on the underside of the top piece like a sandwich. Flow solder with respect to where the design's going to be, and then cut it out. Okay, so when we make our sandwich, we're going to have our top layer with solder flowed across the underside, and we're going to cut it out into exactly what we need. Then we're going to take our bottom layer, put the top layer on, add a little extra solder for insurance, and solder it together like this. And then we will finish cutting out the design to make the bottom piece match. So you see, you do not cut your design out of the bottom piece. You will make your life a lot harder when it comes time to solder. Okay, so you do the design on the top, solder, and then finish cutting out, and you have a nicely cut and shaped piece. Now, watch as I do it in metal. When you are given your silver piece, it's going to be enough for both layers of your ring if you measure correctly. So what that means is measure several times, and then you're going to cut it, one piece for the top and one piece for the bottom. This is the only silver you're going to get. So your one block of silver is going to come like this in one whole piece. Going to measure, draw a line, cut it with your saw, and then you have a top and a bottom. So I've got it set up here. I'm going to show you on copper first because it's easier to see. Then on the silver, you see I've got both pieces on cotter pins, which is going to help me get that heat underneath. I have fluxed both pieces, and now I'm going to place solder on there in a grid-like pattern, and then I'll be back. Alright, so you see that my solder chips are arranged kind of in a grid pattern, but I'm doing a very specific design, so I targeted where my design was going to be so as not to waste solder. Now, I've got my torch on. I'm going to preheat around. I'm really making sure to keep the fire underneath because that just really helps get it even heat. And then now that my flux is too pasty, I can go right over the top. And I'm going to keep the heat on and be very even. Not too fast, not too slow. I just want it to flow right in place, so I'm just sticking with it. And there you go. You see it going? There it went. So I stopped. Now on to the silver. Same thing. Preheat first, just so that my solder tips don't get flung off. Now with silver, you have a much smaller window between the time the solder melts and the metal melts. So as soon as all the solder has flowed, you stop. Nice even heat all the way across. Watching for any bright red spots because we don't want to melt the silver. It's getting ready to go. There it goes, see that? And I stop. It's beautiful and it's tempting to keep going, but with the silver, if you do that, you will melt it. Now I quench, pickle, like normal. After flowing my solder across the back, it looks like this. You can see it's pretty bumpy. It's got some relatively high points. And so I need to sand it so that it looks like this. See how that's a lot flatter, the solder portions are? So this is a sanding board. It's just some sandpaper. It's as easy as it seems. You turn it over, and you just sand it. You don't want to sand all the way down. Don't sand the solder off. Just flatten the solder down. That's going to make it easier to have it sit on our base piece, our bottom piece of sandwich. You see how this side, they have nice little plateaus on the top. This side is still pretty bumpy, so that means I must have been pressing harder on one side than the other. Okay, so it should look like that. Do not sand it off or you'll have to start over.